Hey, what is up guys? It's Stan here, back with another video. In this one, it's finally time for me to give you my review on this 2021 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1X processor. I've had it for a few days now, couple days now, 3 days, something like that. And I've had some time to benchmark and do all of my tests and just overall use the computer, and it is one beast of a machine. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, to kind of set the stage here, I have had a MacBook Pro since 2008, 2009, and every couple generations I would, or even every generation sometimes, I would update to the latest and greatest. And I'm coming from a 16-inch late 2019 MacBook Pro. This is almost maxed out. Besides the storage, it's an almost maxed out system, and that's kind of where I do most of my YouTube rendering, video editing, all that stuff. And moving from that to this system is actually a pretty big difference in my opinion. They're both 16-inch MacBook Pros, but let's talk about the form factor first, because it actually turns out to be a bigger difference than I originally thought. And what I mean by that is the 2019 MacBook Pro is a very tapered design. It is all about form over function. You have the 4 USB ports, and you got this nice little taper, and because of that, the sidewalls of this machine is very, very short, or you don't have much of a sidewall, right? And you have very, very sharp edges. It's kind of the design language of that machine. However, on this machine, you have very straight sidewalls. And it's a little bit thicker than the old machine, and it is also heavier than the old machine. When I first unboxed it, I thought, it's not that big of a deal. And it certainly isn't a big deal, but when actually lifting it and moving it from one place to another, let's say moving it from my nightstand to using it with one hand, you do actually feel the heft as you're moving it around. But certainly that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because of that extra heft and extra thickness, you do have much better airflow, much better cooling, and it's a pro machine. It's meant for professionals, and I certainly like the little bit of extra thickness for all that extra performance. Also, with that form factor change, we got a few changes in the ports. You got 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, or USB 4 ports, and the addition of the SD card slot and the HDMI port. Now, this might be a hot take, but I don't actually really care for the ports. Over the last few years, I have converted everything over to USB 3, or Thunderbolt 3 USB-C, all my USB sticks, and just everything is that already. And now that we've moved on to this machine, I still have all that USB Type-C connection. So, Thunderbolt 3 connection. So it's not that big of a deal. SD cards, SD cards kind of, I've already moved on past that because I'm using CF Express cards for my camera. It's certainly nice once in a while you have an SD card, you can plug it in, but it's not a game changer. One less dongle, great. Now, as for the HDMI port, it's an HDMI 2.0, not a 2.1. When was the last time you used the HDMI port on your computer? Honestly, I can't remember the last time I used it. Certainly, it's not a bad thing. It's always nice to have, but it's not. I don't think it's as big of a game changer as people make it sound like. Oh my God, the return of ports. It's still USB, 4, Thunderbolt 4. That's still the main I/O on the machine. Now, what is changed, what is nice, is the return of MagSafe, because I really miss the old MagSafe. Now we have MagSafe 3. It's a bit thinner, a little bit sleeker than the previous MagSafe, and one significant difference is that it is a lot stronger of a magnet than the previous MagSafe connections. All you need to do is get that plugged near the connector, and it snaps on. And it's really nice because you don't actually have to look down and try to figure out where the connection is. You just bring it up near the connection point, and that magnet takes over, and it is really easy to use. So big props to Apple. Love the MagSafe 3. The last thing I want to talk about the exterior is the redesign of the cooling system, or the airflow. Apple says that this machine has 50% more airflow than the previous 2019 machine. And indeed, if you look at this machine, you have outlets at the back here, and then you have these teeny tiny little inlet cutouts on the side. And that was a big deal at the time because it was the first MacBook Pro that had intake cutouts. And when you compare the intake cutouts on this machine versus the intake cutouts on this machine, you can see these are significantly wider and naturally passes more air. And the end result between that and the low power consumption of the chips and whatever, the combination, the end result is that it is a very quiet system and almost fanless for the most part. You probably haven't noticed, but this entire time I'm actually running a game in the background. And usually a game on a MacBook Pro is its worst nightmare because both the CPU and the GPU is stressed out. And you can see here, it's been running, GPU is maxed out, CPU is bouncing around, and you can't hear the fan. I'm pretty sure that you can't hear the fan because it is spinning, but I want to say it's like spinning at like a 20% out of maximum speed because it's just that much more efficient. And if I bring this microphone up to the keyboard here, you probably can't hear it, honestly. Even if you can, it's not that loud, and it's very easy to ignore this fan. So it's great. The cooling system is great. The efficiency and the temperature of this MacBook Pro is really, really cool to the touch. The bottom, I can easily rest this on my lap without a problem. So big props on the cooling solution of this MacBook Pro. The next thing I want to talk about on the system is the speakers. Now, if you watch the keynote, then you know that Apple touted that the speakers are better than ever. There's 6 speakers. You got the 2 tweeters here, and you've got 4 opposing subwoofers at the bottom of the computer. What I can tell you is that, again, compared to the 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro, which already has really good speakers, that the speaker is noticeably better and it's a more full sound. And I think what helps with that is that, again, with the bigger cutouts at the bottom here, it allows more air to move, and sound is the movement of air, right? So the speaker, basically the cutout is almost opening up that sound a little bit more, and it just sounds better, and it gets really loud. In fact, stupidly loud. It's almost like you can have a dance party in your bedroom with the speakers of this machine, because if you crank it all the way up, it measures over 90 decibels from the speakers, laptop speakers, and even at the maximum loudness or maximum volume, it really doesn't get distorted all that much, and it's perfectly usable. Only it's uncomfortably loud sitting a foot, 2 feet away from the laptop. The next thing on the list I want to talk about is the screen. And with the new introduction of the mini LED screen, the screen gets really bright. It's up to 1600 nits of peak brightness, 1000 nits of sustained brightness on HDR content. On non-HDR content, it doesn't actually get that bright, but still it's brighter than the old machine. Ignoring brightness aside here, the colors though, the colors pop, and it just looks more saturated. The colors, the purples, the reds, they feel more vibrant than the 2019 MacBook Pro. And especially the darks. The darks, I think it's the contrast. You have the dark stuff is really dark, and then the colors just pop behind it, especially in dark mode. It looks really good. I didn't think that it would be that big of a difference, but indeed the Pro XDR, Liquid Retina, whatever they call it, display is certainly a winner. What is one downside of the LED screen is the blooming or halo effect of the local dimming zones. If you have a full array local dimming TV, for example, you might be familiar with haloing and blooming. It's essentially if you have a black background and you have something that is bright and it moves, you might see a trail, a tail, or the zones light up, and you get this haloing effect. And it's very apparent when you move a mouse around, for example. There is blooming effect if you were to have the brightness cranked up all the way on a black screen in a dark room. You can see it. However, I don't think that's a realistic use scenario of this laptop because you're not going to be using the laptop that turned up that bright. With a more reasonable brightness, let's say 40–50% in a dark room, the blooming issue is almost pretty much a non-issue. So I think the takeaway is that, yeah, it's still there, but it's a lot less noticeable and it's a lot easier to ignore, especially if you're not on completely black content. Talking about screen here, you can't ignore the fact that there is a notch up top. Yes, we have a notch. Yes, it is to hide, or it is for the FaceTime camera, which is now upgraded to 1080p. It doesn't bother me. What actually bothers me more about the top of the screen is not the notch, but the top taskbar. This is a tangent, but because they want to have the top taskbar have a connecting area, they enlarged it, but then the text is not necessarily much larger because the font is a fixed size. So it just looks like a big taskbar with small font. It's a little jarring. It's a little tacky compared to the old OS. And I don't know if it's a Monterey thing or if it's just on the 2021 MacBook Pros because of the notch, but I really wish that the taskbar could be shrunk a little bit. Now, speaking of the notch, again, FaceTime camera, 1080p, it is a lot better than the previous camera on the 2019 MacBook Pros. I had a teleconference the other day with this camera and I noticed that everything just looked much crisper. It is a much welcome, FaceTime camera, webcam upgrade. It's still not as good as the camera on the iPhones, but it is much better than basically every other camera that you've had available in a Mac. For the next part here, I want to talk about benchmarks and actual real-world performance figures. I'm not really going to focus in on that all that much about synthetics. I think it's more important to look at how it actually impacts your workflow. So as a refresher, this is an M1 Max with the 32 gig or 32 core GPU, 64 gigs of memory, and 4 terabyte SSD. The 2019 version is the top of the line Intel CPU with same amount of memory, and I think it was a 2 terabyte SSD. So very comparable. In fact, I think that machine was actually more expensive than this one, but that's beside the point. The first test I had was a YouTube video. It was one of my previous videos, about 20 minutes long. It's 4K H.264 source coming out of a Canon R5 camera, being transcoded, and it's not that complicated. There's a few clips, couple streams, clipped together. Very simple YouTube video, and the export took 7 minutes 13 seconds on this machine, while the old one took 23 minutes and 50 seconds. So the old machine was 3 times slower, or it took 3 times longer for that to export. 7 minutes versus 21 minutes, that's a pretty significant decrease in the amount of time needed. Another test I did, and this is kind of gonna blow your mind here, was footage from a Canon C200 RAW footage. So this is really, really hard to actually manipulate. In fact, before I talk about the transcoding, the export numbers, let's just talk about the experience of editing a C200 RAW footage on this machine, because scrubbing through that on this machine was like butter. Playing back that clip, especially if it was a sped up time-lapse-ish clip, like maybe 2 times or 4 times speed, on the 2019 machine, it would skip and it just couldn't, you can look at the side by side, it just couldn't keep up compared to the new machine. The new machine, you couldn't even tell that it was a raw clip. So the export of this, and this was a 3-minute, 27-second project, exported as a ProRes output, and that took the new machine 3 minutes 19 seconds versus 13 minutes and 21 seconds on the old machine. And I did the whole thing over again, and instead of a ProRes output, I chose to export it as an MP4, H.264 MP4, and the end result was very similar. It was 33 minutes and 44 seconds with the new machine and 14 minutes 18 seconds on the old machine. So the percentage delta difference between the two is pretty consistent. And I want to attribute that to, and this is just speculation, but I think it's probably due to the encode and decode engines on the two. You know, I think it's probably bottlenecked bottlenecked by those engines, this on the old computer and the new computer alike. So that's why the deltas or the differences are pretty similar. Moving over to something more graphically intensive, such as gaming here. And I know you don't buy a $4,000 MacBook Pro, you know, for professional stuff to game, but certainly if you've got the horsepower, what's wrong with a little bit of gaming on the side, right? I loaded up World of Warcraft, Shadowlands, on both machines. And the reason I chose this is because it's one of the few native games that you can actually play, and it plays relatively well on these machines. So on the 2019 MacBook Pro, which has a 5500M dedicated graphics card, for the sake of the test, I bumped it up to the native resolution, which is 3072 by 1920, which is about 5.8 megapixels. That crushed the frame rates down to a measly 13 to 15 FPS, really unplayable running at that native resolution of the screen. On this system, however, with the M1 Max, you're able to do anywhere from 55 to 75 FPS, and sometimes even go above 120 FPS, depending on what's on the screen, at the native resolution of 3456 by 2234, which is 7.7 megapixels, which is almost really similar to a true 4K display. So the graphics card on this, they say it's graphically similar to a 3080, depending on the power limit. And indeed, it really does look like it's a very, very capable graphics card. On the desktop here, that's going to be somewhere near a 3060 or a 3060 Ti with the actual, unconstrained power limits. That's very, very impressive performance, especially when you consider how much heat it was outputting and how quiet it was. Oh man, it's really a big deal in my opinion. So at those frame rates and at 4K resolution, near 4K resolutions, those are perfectly respectable FPS. In World of Warcraft or in most AAA titles that you'll see. To sum up the general experience that I've had is that this machine does everything very, very well and competently, and it does it with style because it's not hot, the design is immaculate, and just everything about it is so great. The screen is great, the keyboard is good again, and the form factor is great. But really, if you were to take a step back and just think about who is this machine for? Is this machine for you? I think you really need some kind of professional workload to be able to kind of justify the system, or you could be really rich and screw money, right? So just buy the best and latest and greatest. But to be able to truly utilize that M1 Max CPU, you really need a intensive graphics workload, or you intend to play games, but then that's probably a pretty weak argument to go for the Max for that. The other point is I did get 64 gigs of memory on the system. Looking back at it now, maybe that was a little overkill. Final Cut probably doesn't need 64 gigs of memory. I probably would have been able to get by with 32, but hey, more is better, right? Everything that I've talked about here really only applies for the 16-inch MacBook Pro, because the 14-inch is a smaller chassis. It's going to be naturally a little bit worse at dissipating that heat. And especially since you can get the same chip in this machine as the 14-inch, just be aware of that, because it's probably going to be a little bit louder, a little bit hotter, and maybe I don't think you're going to run into throttling issues, but who's to say, right? So yeah, hopefully this video gives you something to think about, something to chew on if you are actually on the fence about purchasing this computer. If this video was useful, you can always hit that like button. It helps the channel greatly, and I appreciate it. And if you want to see more videos on the MacBook Pro or tech videos in general, perhaps consider subscribing. This channel is generally dedicated to tech and stuff like that. So be glad to have you around. Anyway, my name is Stan, and I'll see you guys in the next one.